everybody, to our monthly online lecture series put on by the American Rock Art Research Association, or ARARA. As Peter mentioned, I'm David Kaiser. I'm a board member of ARARA, one of 8 elected officials. We represent, the organization represents a diverse community of professionals and enthusiasts. We're dedicated to research, education, and preservation of rock art as a unique and at-risk cultural resource. Every year we publish a peer-reviewed journal, we have a newsletter. Normally we hold an annual conference where we all get together, present papers, see rock art. And certainly if you have been a member and you haven't done so, we encourage you to renew your membership. If otherwise, we invite you to join, help us continue events like this. As far as tonight's lecture, it is part of an ongoing series. Previous lectures you can be found on our YouTube page. You can search ARARA Rock Art on YouTube, or there's a link on our website. Also, check out Facebook and our website for more information on our organization or for information on upcoming talks. Again, a reminder, if you have any questions, please send that through the chat function to the host, and Peter will relay the questions at the end of the talk. Tonight's talk is by William Hyder. He's been researching and writing about Chumash and Basket-Maker rock art for the past 40 years. He received an MA in political science and anthropology from the University of California, Santa Barbara. And he's a research associate of the anthropology department at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, as well as a board member of the California Rock Art Research Association. So tonight, he will be talking about revisiting the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History's 1935 Hurricane Deck expedition, excuse me. And Bill, why don't you just take it away?
All right, let me get start. So this project started about a year ago. It was actually a suggestion of Lee and Amy Marymore as a memorial to Rick Berry, one of our ARARA members who passed away, and a group of people came together and are working on producing a publication in memory of Rick. And I'm unfortunately also have to dedicate it to a gentleman by the name of Tom Natow. Tom's on the left. Tom was a photographer and got very interested in rock art. And since I suffered a stroke in 2017, I can't get out into the field anymore. And Tom, being an excellent photographer, went out and used my eyes and feet to revisit the sites. He suffered a heart attack and passed away a couple of months ago. We only met once in person, and that was at the time that I presented this talk, which he is the co-author of. And I credited him with co-authorship because half of the ideas in this talk came from him. And the picture that I've presented here is him standing or sitting in front of a little cave called the Needle Cache. There were 3 bull roars and some other ceremonial artifacts that were found in this cache. It's in a very remote and difficult to find location in Hurricane Deck, where the studies is based upon. And I put this in because going off of a photograph and a few descriptives of where this might be found, he did relocate it. So with that introduction and dedication, we'll get started. Hurricane Deck is this spectacular natural formation. It's almost maybe 3 feet wide or so at the top. There is a trail that runs up there. but at the base of Hurricane Deck are a number of rock outcrops. And I'm going to start at this end where you see a little clearing. The rock art sites, archaeological sites, caches, etc., run this full length. David Banks Rogers, who was in charge of the research expedition. He actually didn't do the work. He hired somebody else to do it, but he was the director of anthropology at the museum. He went in first. He said, to reach the district at all is a most trying ordeal. We went in absolutely light, carrying nothing in the way of luggage beyond our canteens of water. This latter was essential as the limited water of that entire region is very unwholesome, even the guide's dog, and the horses refusing to touch it, as thirsty as they were. It's still a rugged area. It's a wilderness area, but it has several sites which are heavily visited even to this day. The sites were originally discovered when the CCC decided to put a road in through the National Forest. The road, you can watch my mouse, the road would have run through here and around, going up through the area and over into another part of Santa Barbara County. Today, all of this length of road has washed out and is gone. The road stops today at a Forest Service camp, and everything else has been abandoned. But this photograph of their first trip in are the two rangers that contacted the museum and let them know that CCC members who were camped down here at the bottom, we're going back into this rugged area and coming back with baskets and artifacts and so forth. And they were concerned about what was being lost. And so they called out David Banks Rogers. This is him here, always in a tie in a camp. This gentleman is McLeish, who did all the mapping for the expedition. And this gentleman was the acting director of the museum at the time. Snow's, who was hired to do the survey, we didn't know much about Snow, but in doing the research in the museum, I found the letters that hired Snow. Snow at the time was working as a photographer and an archaeologist for the museum, Northern Arizona Museum in Flagstaff, and had to wait to start the expedition because he was going to photograph dances at Hopi. And at the end of the exposition, he terminated it early to go to New Mexico to excavate a site in New Mexico. But he found and identified 40 rock shelters of archaeological value. He made collections from them that hadn't been disturbed. And he noted that they displayed weird polychrome drawings, some impossible to describe adequately with words. Roger summarized all of his work, and he said it's an inhospitable nature of the area, inhibited residential use. Better sites for living were nearby, and it was unlikely to be used for hunting as little game encountered. But he summarized everything and said, one suggestion appears tenable as to the presence of the prehistoric remains we found present here. And that is that they are of a religious nature, that for a considerable period in the past, these rock shelters were looked upon as sacred places to which primitive man came for purposes of worship. It may be that groups from various places thus came. Well, he was consistent with some of the themes that had already been started in Chumash rock art research. Kroeber in 1925 attributed the Chumash rock art to shamans. Campbell Grant in '65 agreed that rock art was only in the mountains and the work of shamans. Hudson and Andre in '78 identified Condor Cave in the Hurricane Deck area as a winter solstice religious site attributed to shaman priests. Hudson and Lee in '84 proposed that shamans created rock art to maintain the sacred, to preserve the cosmic equilibrium, and to acquire supernatural power. Hudson, Whitley, and others argued that rock art was the product of primarily male shamans and off limits to everyday activities. But Steve Horn and myself, and most recently David Robinson, document that most rock art sites co-occur with evidence of other seasonal activities. And Weinhold, who created her dissertation under David Robinson, did a GIS study of the Chumash territory, and she demonstrated that rock art sites are integrated into Chumash gathering, processing, ceremonial, economic, political, and mythological networks. In other words, rock art is related or correlated with almost everything that people do in society. So let's revisit Roger's conclusions. He said that 75% of the rock shelters are cache caves. There's an abundant presence of BRMs, and there's a lot of cupules. Well, if you take a closer look, in this general area was a historic village. I'm not going to point out where it actually was. And going up this canyon and this canyon are other sites that were probably villages even earlier than the historic times, and villages would move around so that you wouldn't expect them to be in one spot for tens of thousands of years. This is the Hurricane Deck, and I've divided it into two areas: the Lone Tree Potrero Resource Area and the Lost Valley Resource Area. And that's what the original people who went in and studied these areas divided it into, those two areas. It's very difficult to access, but what's important about these two areas is that, in fact, if you are a healthy individual, you can be from this general area of the historic village to one of these resource areas in about an hour of hiking. So they're not really that far away from a historic village. I'm just going to give a quick overview of these two areas. There are the three major rock art sites here are Negus Cave, Bear Paw Cave, and what they called Snow Site E. And I've sort of arranged out here, there's cache caves, painting sites, so you can see the relative location of cache caves and painted sites and bedrock mortars in this area. And these are the historic travel routes that people would have used going into the area. There's one other piece that I have lifted from Weinhold, one of Robinson's graduate students. We have talked about, and in the Chumash area, sites being public and private. Weinhold proposed using inclusive and exclusive. Inclusive being visible from an activity area, and exclusive not being visible from outside the activity area. And Negus Cave is an example of a site that you can't see the paintings unless you are inside the shelter. Both at Bear Paw, which is right here, and Site E, which is in this area, you can see the paintings from food processing areas associated with the site. The other has 4 caves: Condor Cave, Pool Rock. This is Campbell Grant's site, Santa Barbara 16. And this is a site that a friend of mine and I discovered in the 80s that wasn't visited during the expedition, called Mushroom Rock. And cupules and paintings are back in here, and there's bedrock mortars out here. So I'm going to take a fresh look at this and really focus not a lot on recording all the rock art, but on looking at the rock art with a different set of eyes from 1935 and even more recently. Typically, we look at Chumash rock art and how they relate to shamanic visions. The fantastic imagery reinforces the notion that they are visions. But archaeology plays a more prominent role, and David Robinson's work in the Chumash area emphasizes, makes an emphasis on the landscape in which they are located in and the taskscape that the rock art is located in. And the taskscape refers to the fact that most of these rock art sites are visible from bedrock mortar sites, which are typically female taskscapes. So Robinson, if you take his conclusions and start with the assumption that male shamans are responsible for the art, then he asks the question, was the art directed at indoctrinating females into the culture? And I'm asking a different set of questions tonight. And I'm going to look at the role of females in making rock art, the role of rock art in medicine, and take a little different view from rock art being winter solstice sites and take a fresh look at the cosmology and what might be going on. And what is dominant in the motifs in the hurricane deck area are bear paws. Here's a bear paw here, a bear paw here. There's another bear paw that's worn away here. And here are cupules, bedrock mortars in direct association. There's also a lot of cupules in these caves. And Tom, when he was out refinding sites for me that had caches and bedrock mortars but no rock art, found this site, and he observed right here in the midst of these bedrock mortars is a very small bear paw. And that became important in analyzing what was going on in this area from my point of view. The bear paw or bear track petroglyphs are the predominant element in this area. They appear elsewhere in the Chumash area, but nowhere as frequently as here in the hurricane deck area. Bear is important as a dream helper, a totem, and as a medicine shaman. If you dream of bear, you may become a bear shaman, and a bear shaman has the power to transform into a bear. They could also perform the bear dance, travel rapidly across the landscape, harm people, and were generally safe from bears. But the bear was also a Chumash totem, a clan totem, and it was one of the two high status clan totems. And I believe that that makes it more relevant to understand the bear paw in relationship to clans. John Johnson, based on mission records, concludes that clans were primarily matrilineal and residency was matrilineal. Robinson notes that if men moved into the landscape of their wives, the landscape where the gathering sites are located, and we know that bedrock mortars were owned by women, and if the men were the ones making the rock art, then their art would serve to integrate the men into the women's landscape. It kind of makes sense. But while it's possible that male bear shamans, doctors, etc., chose to deliberately place bear paw petroglyphs not just within the view, but immediately adjacent to female activities, it's more likely that females chose to mark their processing site with bear paws. The sheer numbers suggest to us that the bear paw is a symbol of the dominant clan using the area for seasonal harvest. And we just so happen to know from marriage records that the historic village site that is close to Hurricane Deck, where people would have been coming to harvest, was in fact a bear clan site as the dominant clan for this area. That would have been traced to the women, not to the men. And we know that by the fact that Chumash chiefs settled in the village of their wife's clan if they were not of the dominant clan, and if they were the dominant clan, they remained in the village where they were born, and the wives came to them. And so we know that the historic village was most likely a bear clan as the dominant clan in this area. And here's a view of the mini bear paws. This is at the bear paw site. Here's bear paws here. They're in all different forms. And at Pool Rock, there's mini bear paws as well. You can see the petroglyphs. So this got me looking at the cupules and the bear paws. And if my interpretation is correct that the bear paw represents the bear clan, the cluster of bear tracks at Bear Paw and Pool Rock would mark them as the centers of the two activity areas as we've identified for the hurricane deck. And they are in fact in the two separate areas, or these two large sites. The bear paws would be communicating the status of the owners to outsiders and remind the men who married into the village the power of the clan. And the females would be from the bear clan. Cupule boulders themselves are common in villages and camps around the Chumash area. And usually they have no apparent patterns. In the hurricane deck region, virtually all cupules are associated with the presence of bedrock mortars. And since bedrock mortars are produced and owned by females, and the activities required in producing a bedrock mortar are much the same as that of producing cupules, I'm suggesting it's possible that the cupules represent the activities of powerful females in the interior regions of the Chumash territory. And here's Bear Paw here. Here's a remote processing site. And these cupules are in direct association and part of this site. In the Pool Rock area, this ridge up here is filled with cache caves, and right below it are bedrock mortars and cupules. At Bear Paw itself, this is a photograph from 1935. The cave with the paintings is right here, and we're interested in this wall. This is a more recent photograph. Here's the Pool Rock Cave itself. You can see the bear paws, the cupules. There are an incredible number of cupules in various patterns here. And what's important at Bear Paw is that these cupules here extend out. This is a shot from 1935. Because of visitation, this ground level has now worn away, and that's one of the reasons why they're trying to reduce the visitation to these sites. But this string of cupules continues right here, and as you can see, the ground level has changed. But it runs on up the rock, and it runs all the way up the distance of the rock. These cupules continue, and along the way, you'll find pairs of bear paws along this line of cupules. And then this geometric figure right here, which is hard to interpret because there's nothing like it in the Chumash area. But one of the primary foodstuffs that was being gathered back in this area are agave plants. And I'm suggesting that this may be an image of an agave plant after the stem has come up and it's flowered, which would be the time that it would be harvested and roasted. As I say, there are cupules throughout the Chumash area, but nowhere near the density as you find in the interior. These are cupules at the Bear Paw site associated with bedrock mortar and food processing. This is further back into the area. This is a site called the Goody site, and these cupules run the full length. This is a cleft between two large boulders, and the cupules run the full length inside that cleft. And so I'm suggesting, as we look at this, rather than females being passive recipients of male cultural messaging, I'm suggesting that they are necessary active participants in giving voice to important locations of power on the landscape. In other words, it's not the men that are making these cupules, it's the women that are doing the food processing here. And why are these sites powerful? Well, I'm suggesting that at least two of these sites happen to also be medicine sites. And why do I suggest that? Well, we have evidence, cultural evidence, that springs are powerful medicine sites, and rock art is associated in some cases with medicine sites. And I think that there's new evidence that people have overlooked in the past and is not clearly documented in the ethnography. And this is at Bear Paw. This is a crack in the rock with paintings, and you'll see these pieces of vegetation. Here's one that's photographed that was collected. And they wrote back in 1935, one item discovered in several of the grottos is not so easily disposed of on logical grounds. This was the presence in them, usually serially in crevices of the walls, of quid-like wads of much chewed inner bark of some shrub or tree. Whether these wads of bark are the residue from some domestic course, or were the products of medicinal venturings, or had religious significance, I am at present unable to say. In 1976, a graduate student at UC Santa Barbara took a sample of these, proposing that they were Datura, and he abandoned that line of research, and we never found out what he discovered in his analysis. But in David Robinson's area, they found something very similar, and they, in fact, sampled 15 of the quids, and 14 proved to be Datura. Now, everything we know about Datura is that it was used in puberty ceremonies, it was used to gain visions, and it was used in curing. All the ethnographic uses of Datura among the Chumash is that it was done under the guidance of an experienced guide, because Datura is in fact lethal, and it was prepared into a tea and you would drink it. There's no ethnographic evidence of chewing Datura in Southern California ethnography, but there is a Pima song that refers to eating leaves as making one dizzy, and drinking the flower makes one stagger. And I'm proposing that these chewed leaves of Datura are in fact evidence of a medicinal use of Datura. We know from medical evidence that if you chew Datura as opposed to boiling it, that you get a much lower dose. And Datura has the effect of dealing with asthma, dealing with exhaustion, dealing with dehydration. There's some evidence that Datura fights cancer cells. And so it's not beyond belief that the Chumash in fact understood that Datura had a medicinal use, that one could do on their own by chewing leaves, as opposed to going through the process of fasting and preparing to have a vision and then drinking datura, and you would fall into a stupor and have visions, and then people would help you determine them. And I think that what we are looking at here is that these sites have a medicinal use. And these pictures are all from bear paw. Tom noticed something very interesting in that right here you have a natural bear's head at the bear paw site. But in attempting to relate the rock art to some of these uses, bear paw has a very unfortunate situation that most of the rock art, this cave was probably almost entirely painted inside, almost all gone now. Same thing, this shelter, there's just traces of painting. It's mostly worn away. The cupules run around out here. This is the cave in the upper right-hand corner that I'm circling with my mouse, which is where those quids were stuck in the crevice in the wall. So we know that they were chewing datura, and then after they spit it out, they put the chewed parts back together and then stuck it into crevices. So there was a purpose in what they were doing, and I'm suggesting that purpose is that they were using datura as medicine, and they were doing it at these particular painted sites because they were recognized as being powerful sites on the landscape. So there's no chewed daturas from Pool Rock. And how do I relate that to bear medicine? Well, as I look in the painted shelter at Bear Rock, at Pool Rock, it goes back and narrows down to the inside. And if you're sitting in the back part of this cave, of this shelter, the paintings are revolved around you. They're in your vision across the ceiling and out the wall. And on the left-hand side is this painting of what I believe is a bear shaman. This is a photograph from 1935. Campbell Grant, when he drew it, looks like this photograph, but it has been eroded over the years. This is my photograph from 1982, somewhat enhanced using de-stretch to make it brighter. But you can see the loss of white pigment in the lizard. The black has been eroding away, exposing this bird underneath. And there's some other figures in here. So the question was this bird originally painted over the so-called bear shaman that I'm calling it, or was it painted first and then the bear shaman pointed over it? And using de-stretch, we can finally say that yes, the bird was painted first, and the red outlining in the body was painted next. The two figures in X's are figures that appear on other ceremonial items. Then there's a little figure right down here that's hard to make out, but there's an anthropomorphic type figure here that I'll refer to towards the end of the talk. And then this design in red and black, it may or may not be a religious symbol, but it's significant that when the Indians were building the Santa Barbara mission, in the bell towers, they carved and painted this same exact design in red and black. In 1925, that bell tower collapsed in an earthquake, so it's not there anymore. But there's one photograph showing that the native artisans were incorporating some of these figures into the church. And this kind of net pattern here on the right, there's a lot of different ways to explain it, but I'm going to talk about that as being the Milky Way, which was identified as being a net pattern. And again, that will come in later in the talk. So what's going on in the rest of the paintings? The illness came about because you either violated the rules of society, you came under the influence of a malevolent supernatural actor. These are people that, malevolent beings that lived in the lower world. And Chumash went through a datura ceremony because that gave you personal power, and personal power allowed you to fight off illness. So what do we see here? We see a figure here that's headless. It's outlined in red. That could be a malevolent being from the underworld. This fantastic creature here is a red ant in the flight form. And red ants in some ceremonies would be put in eagle down balls, and you would swallow them and they would bite the inside of your stomach and create a state not unlike taking datura or having some kind of vision. There's a creature here that's called a tick. It's pretty close to a tick, but ticks have more legs. But there is a tick-like creature in Chumash mythology that is in the underworld and comes out to infect people at night. This appears to be a rattlesnake pattern, but it's misshapen. And here's a lizard, which is also misshapen and misformed. These are all attributes of the evil, malevolent actors that lived in the underworld and were responsible for making people sick. This panel ends moving from left to right with a snake that's not misshapen, and a snake had certain healing patterns. And so I think what we're looking at is a healing cave where the evil spirits are represented in the cave, and you would come and sit inside the cave, and you have these two powerful medicine actors on either side to help you deal with whatever was affecting you in your life. Bear comes up again in the Campbell Grant SB 16. This is a small shelter. You can't see this from outside today. This is the painted rock. You have to compare that to Grant's drawing and to a D-stretch enhancement. The person who did this D-stretch added this dark color inside. Amy Marymore recently visited this on a trip into the backcountry, and she believes she can see more traces of this. It's very hard to bring out, but Campbell Grant's drawing does appear substantially correct. And what's interesting about this so-called bear figure is it does have power in these protrusions from its head, which may represent power. So that's a little more evidence of bear involved in this area. So there's one third district called the West End, or Site E by Snow. These are the resource gathering area here, the Bear Paw resource gathering area. Site E can be accessed from either side. Today, if you try to get into Site E, you have to climb several waterfalls. It was a very difficult for Snow and his team to get into this site. But it is more isolated, and it actually has a relationship to this idea of power and datura. Here's a shot from 1935 looking into the area. This is Tom's shot from about a year ago. This boulder here has has large, these are abnormally large cupules on it. And there's a bedrock mortar at the top. I don't know much about why that bedrock mortar would be there, because the rock is about as tall as a person, so it's not easy to access it. But again, Amy, on her last trip in, took a closer look at it for me and found that there are red painted lines that show up with D-stretch inside this mortar. So it has some significance. But what's on the other side of it, now I've moved to the other side of the rock, there's a gorge coming down, and this is the painted shelter at Site E. You get into that shelter by coming down through some hand and toe holds here to get into it. It's not an easy site to get into, and it's a straight drop off below it. The rocks back here had a number of cache caves, baskets, etc. But what's important at this site, in addition to the paintings, is this outcrop right here in this little alcove. In that alcove, I'll just read Snow's description. The interesting thing about the shelter is the heap of burned stone, ranging in size from 1 inch to 5 or 6 inches in diameter. The most of the stones have been burned and were of native sandstone in composition. Intermingling with the stones were pieces of hematite paint. About 75 or 100 pieces of varying shades of red and yellow of varying quality were counted, the best samples of which were kept for study. The whole of the heap of stones was covered with dirt and fine ash mixed with very little or no charcoal. I didn't put in Tom's site of this, a picture of this, because it still looks like this today. But these are the samples of hematite or pigment taken from this burned area. And there's yellow ochre and red ochre. When you run your finger along the edge of this piece of yellow ochre, it is in fact very bright ochre. And this red piece has been partially abraded. And most of the pieces are covered with dark deposits like this. And I think this is one of the most significant things that they failed to recognize what it was, and it was just by happen chance that it dawned on me what was going on. This description of the cave, there was a deposit of fine ash on the floor. There's pieces of paint. There's a rat nest in the rear. That rat's nest had chews, the datura chews back in the rat's nest. What I've not been able to go back, and Tom passed away before he could check it out for me, is that there is in fact a crack running right along here, and I suspect that that's where the chews were located, was in this crack, and over time they fell out or the rats removed them. But in addition to the chews, there's hematite, plugs of clay, crude pestles, there's hematite paint, there's pieces of white chalk paint, etc. This midden is filled with chunks of hematite and paint. And here are the bedrock mortars and the cupules here. On the other wall are some simple paintings, not quite like the other sites. And there is yellow pigment in here. And what I'm suggesting from here is that, and I could go into more detail, but I don't have time tonight. The fact that red and yellow are in the same roasting pit is significant. It suggests that they deliberately made an anaerobic environment where they could heat the ochre to a warm enough degree. You can't just take ochre and have a pigment. You need to roast the ochre to drive the water out of it, so that you can grind it to a fine enough degree, to a small enough size that you make an actual pigment. The problem is, if you roast yellow ochre, it turns red, and the yellow is yellow because there is an oxygen and hydrogen molecule attached to the iron oxide that makes it red. And if you heat it above 700 degrees, you lose that OH and it turns red. But you need to heat the yellow ochre if you're going to make pigment. And so I'm suggesting that we now have evidence that they understood the temperatures. They built an anaerobic environment. Furthermore, I'm suggesting that the presence of the Datura quids in this site represent a different form of medicine. We know that Chumash produced pigment cakes and traded them, and the pigment cakes were identified as having atashwan. Atashwan is the power that you get from taking Datura. That is the power that you need to maintain your health, the power that medicine men need to heal you if you don't have the power to do it yourself. And so I'm suggesting that they were chewing Datura while they were making pigment cakes here, and that the act of chewing Datura is passing that medicine into the pigment. I'm also further suggesting that the fact that the bedrock mortars and the cupules that are intermixed with them is that this process is being carried out by females as opposed to men. That's my interpretation, and I'm sticking to it. And I'm going to end with my my third observation on Hurricane Deck. Travis Hudson and Ernest Underhay identified Condor Cave as a winter solstice site. This is my photograph at top of the sun rising over what they called the heel stone at winter solstice. This is the condor that the site takes its name from. And here's a bear paw it's painted over. I'm suggesting that it's not actually a winter solstice site. Having been there at the winter solstice, it's been described as a light beam entering the cave. It is daylight by the time the light beam enters the cave. And it would not be a place that you would try to go to at the winter solstice, because the winter solstice ceremonies took place in the villages, not in remote locations like this. Instead, I'm thinking these sites relate more to the Milky Way. And here's Rick Berry's photograph of a site called Indian Creek, which has been interpreted as the Milky Way. The Milky Way was the path of the pinon gatherers and the road of the dead. And what's significant, and I've been there at night to see this, Hurricane Deck running up here forms a perfect horizon for observing the stars at night. And in relationship, this is Pool Rock over here on the right, and Condor Cave over here on the left. The Milky Way was the ghost road. It intersects many places where mythological beings. It was important in the Hutash ceremony, which is the harvest ceremony in the fall. And it also was important in the winter solstice and time. And that's a time of ceremonies for the dead on a 3-year cycle. So why do I think that what we're looking at is the Milky Way? This is at Pool Rock. This is an upper cave that today you need to be a climber to get into it. The cave is filled with cupules. And here's the feature that I'm most interested in. And if you look right there, you'll see 3 little lines. This is a photograph from 1935. This bear paw, which is right here, is now gone because people have been in the cave and the floor is very fragile and they've destroyed the bear paw. But this set of cupules are aligned on a north-south basis, and the Milky Way divides on the southern end, and one end goes to the land of the dead at the winter solstice, and the other hand goes to if you're bad, you go into the underworld and become one of those evil creatures that infects people. And I think this line here crossing it is representing the west-east horizon, which is kind of the horizon that Hurricane Deck creates. Again, at Condor Cave, this is the hole in the rock that's supposed to be the marker for the winter solstice. There are cupules leading up to it. But above the hole is this set of cupules that looks like a fish, which is a common design in the Chumash area, but it also bifurcates. This happens to be aligned with the orientation of the Milky Way in the fall when the harvest ceremony happens. And back at Bear Paw, right in here is a very small little recess. This is a shot. This is Tom's shot in that recess. Give you an idea of scale. When you stick your head into this hole, you don't have any room to move and you can no longer see the paintings. So this is a very small recess. I mentioned at the bottom of the so-called bear shaman at Pool Rock, there was a red anthropomorph. Here's that same figure on the left end of this painting. But if you look at the fine line detail here, this is a de-stretch enhancement of it. And I believe what we are looking at here, once again, is a painting of the Milky Way, much like the one at Indian Creek that I showed the picture of from Rick Berry. And a number of these elements appear in that panel as well. And it just so happens that these paintings is in a location that's oriented northeast to southwest. At the northeast end, back in here, it's kind of hard to make out in this shot are plant forms. And on the southwest end is this figure from Pool Rock. I believe what we're looking at here is the alignment of the Milky Way at the time of the harvest period. And at the northeast end is where the Pinyon gathering area is. So at this time of year, the Milky Way leads to harvesting resources, as opposed to the Milky Way at the time of winter solstice is the road of the dead. So that's a quick look through 3 different alternative interpretations of Chumash rock art without having to interpret exactly what it is. And I thank John Johnson and the staff at the anthropology department that made the resources available to me to do this study, including all the notes and field notes from the time. Mark Oliver and Wayne Marshall, who made many trips with me into the 80s into the backcountry, exploring these sites. Kathy Conti deserves thank you. She first proposed that she and I do this study back in 1990, but I moved away from Santa Barbara and we never did it. I have to thank my wife for allowing me to make the trips to do this. And the last thank you here is a number of people associated with the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History have contributed funds to do a research publication in the memory of Rick Berry. And they're not on here, but again, it was Lee and Amy Marimore who proposed that we do this. And with that, I'm open for questions. I think I'm back.
Yes. So thank you very much, Bill. That was a really interesting talk. So we have had some questions already show up in chat. If you haven't had a chance to put your question in, please feel free to do that now. And I'll go through some of them and I'll have Bill reply. So let me start my own video back up. Okay, so let's see here. All right, so we had some questions about the bedrock mortars. Do we know what was ground up in those mortars? Are there any chemical traces?
Um, None of these sites have been studied to that degree, and so I'm not going to speculate on what they were grinding up, but there are a number of food plants back here. I mean, in 1935, they viewed these sites as being barren and no animal activity and just not being a useful area for anything other than religious purposes. But the Chumash burned regularly to promote the growth of seed plants. And in fact, there's a small remnant around Bear Paw of oak trees. And if we go back in time, I believe these sites were being burned, and so you would have had a much more open environment. You can barely walk through it today because the manzanita and brush is so thick. Manzanita needs to burn, the chaparral environment needs to burn at least every 40 years to be healthy. And in 1935, they were right at the end of running cattle in this area. So prior to 1935, in that period right after the Chumash had moved out of the backcountry into the missions, cattle ranchers moved in. So it was much more open. There were more grasses, there were more oaks. I think the environment was much different at the time of contact in this area. So it would have been an area very rich in foodstuffs. And there are some small middens at these sites. In the middens is some evidence of chipping debris that might have been done by hunters. The cache caves were filled with artifacts that would be used in gathering and storing food. There was also a discovery of a large piece of gypsum which belongs in another report. That's something we never had evidence of the Chumash using gypsum, and now I know that in fact they used gypsum in making pigment, which is also back in this area quite close to Site E. So there's a lot more there, but I'm just touching on these three issues. Hopefully someday somebody will go back and do a full study of what they discovered in these sites.
Yeah, how much do we know about the Chumash from oral history? Like you were mentioning that the Bear Clan was predominant in that area. Do we know that from oral history, or are you making that as an inference from the
No, we know
Bear
that
Claw?
from there's ethnography. And Harrington worked a lot with the Chumash, collecting their language. He was primarily a linguist, but he did that by having people, whatever their knowledge was, to talk about what they knew. So he had one person build a plank canoe. The Chumash are very famous for their redwood plank canoes. They actually built one that was displayed in 1915 at the Panama, California exposition in San Diego, and is now at the Museum of Natural History. And so in building the canoe, he talked about what he was doing in Chumash, described the tools and so forth, and that's how Harrington was gathering that information. Raphael Solares, his daughter, Maria Solares, related a Chumash mythology, and that's where most of what we know about the clans and so forth came from her. She lived in the valley. Raphael was a shaman, if you want to call him that. His expertise was in cosmology and he was a Bear Clan member. And so she was a Bear Clan member, and he lived in the chief's village that would have been the village closest to the one related to Hurricane Deck. And it's from marriage patterns from the mission records that we know the clans and where they were located. And it's from that data that that we know that the Bear Clan was important in that village that's close to the Hurricane Deck. The people who would have been using it lived in that village, and they would have been the ones going out and gathering there. So we have good information, but for example, there is nothing in any of the Southern California ethnographies about chewing datura. There is plenty about it being boiled and made into a tea, and then you would drink it, and you had to be knowledgeable in what you were doing, because you would take the root. It had to be the right size for the person you were giving the tea to, and so forth, and it was always done under guidance. There's no ethnography about chewing datura, but now we know from several rock art sites in the Chumash area, the other one being in David Robinson's area where he's working, that they were chewing datura and then they were sticking it into the crevices of the rock. That's a deliberate act. The other thing that they chewed was agave leaves. They would chew agave leaves, spit them out, roll them into a ball, and then rehydrate them and use them as pacifiers for babies. And there's a third site that I didn't really talk about here that had chewed cuds. When I looked at the chewed cuds from that site, in fact, they were agave, and that has a much different, it's stringy. It doesn't look like the cuds at Bear Paw and at Site E. I've not had them tested, so there's a possibility they are not datura, but everything we know right now says, there's 90% probability that they are in fact datura when somebody tests them in the future.
Yeah, did any of the ethnographers talk to women?
Yeah, Maria Solares was a female. She talked to Harrington. Whether or not he had good information that a female might have imparted to a female ethnographer, that we don't have any way of judging that, because we don't have female ethnographers that were collecting data from those last people. But I'm extrapolating from what we do know.
Yeah, I guess you might be adventurous and see if you could get any DNA out of some of those quids.
Yeah, it's I'm hoping that we can work with David Robinson. Like I said, he's tested 14 of 15 quids from one other site, and 14 of them were datura. And so hopefully one of these days, I've been identifying this stuff in the museum collections for a future researcher to come in and make a more scientific study of the collections that were recovered. What's interesting is that needle cache, so-called needle cache, had 3 bulrars, a basket, and two complete mussel shells that were filled with asphaltum, holding them together. And then about 20 years ago now, I got to stop and think for a minute. I forget how old, 35 years ago, some Boy Scouts in the opposite direction of Hurricane Deck from that same village, about equidistance from Hurricane Deck, but going the other direction, found another cache which John Johnson recovered for the Forest Service, and it contained almost the exact set of artifacts as the needle cache. There were 2 bulrars, there were 2 mussel shells filled with asphaltum, and a basket, the same as in Hurricane Deck. So there's more to interpret from these collections than I've just scratched the surface, and trying to pose questions for the next generation to look at with fresh eyes. That's
Yeah. To follow up on the DNA, I know that there was, I recall hearing of like a gum that had been chewed from which they were able to extract human DNA. So I'm wondering if you'd considered getting human DNA out of some of these quids.
So John Johnson's actually doing those kinds of DNA studies. From the DNA studies that he's been conducting, we know the Chumash were on the Santa Barbara coast for the last 10,000 years. He's also using the marriage records and DNA studies to try knowing where somebody came from. So if he knows today you're descended from marriage records back to the time of Spanish contact, with those DNA studies that he's done and people that have cooperated with it, he can point that they do come from the areas that the marriage records show. I didn't want to point it out there, but one of the things that was discovered when they did the research in 1935 is that there was a cemetery that they partially excavated, and that's the reason I didn't point out where that was located. But the DNA done from some of those burials show ties to the Santa Barbara coast as well as within the San Ynez Valley. So yes, DNA is an important research tool, but that's, you know, I'm 70 years old and retired. I'm leaving that for the next generation.
Yeah, I mean, potentially you could determine the sex of the chewers of that the datura quids, and then you could maybe test your hypothesis that it was women leave it there.
And as you know, I like to put things out that can be falsified. So yeah, maybe the next generation will say, let's give that a try.
Yeah. Any thoughts on why they stored the chewed bark as opposed to just spitting it out?
I'm guessing that that's part of recognizing that it's significant. If it was being used for medicine, that may be why they were storing it in the cracks, to recognize the power of the place and help enhance the power of the place. And kind of what I'm suggesting there is that rock art sites aren't powerful because rock art is painted there. Rock art is painted there because the sites are recognized as having power. That's a fine distinction, but I think that is an important distinction, particularly when we're looking at Chumash sites, and we know that they did recognize places on the landscape as having power and having healing power, and I think that's what we're seeing at Bear Paw and Pool Rock, is that those are both medicine sites. They have other activities going on. They have gathering activities, etc. But I think they're recognizing the rock itself as having a certain degree of medicinal power. And at Site E, where they're processing the pigments, there I think the act of chewing the datura is to help impart that medicine into the pigments that were then formed into cakes and traded throughout the Chumash area and outside the Chumash. That's another talk.
Yeah, there's a comment somebody made that similar quids are found in basket maker sites with tobacco and yucca fiber.
That doesn't surprise me, and that may also have been a form of medicine. I believe tobacco is viewed as being a medicine in many cases, and So it would be a similar activity. I think a lot of these activities have very deep roots in time and have counterparts across the Southwest. That these are old traditions that we're seeing. They've changed and morphed as cultures grew apart and became more unique to themselves as opposed to other people. But I think the roots of many of those run very deep in the culture of the American Southwest.
Yeah. Now, related to datura effects, again on vision, I've heard that one of the effects is to see dots around items. I wonder if that might be tied into the cupules, since the cupules are sort of lines of dots.
Well, I didn't go deep into the paintings, but the paintings, and particularly in the Hurricane Deck area, the paintings are often covered with fine white dots that may be related to the datura use. Tom Blackburn proposed that for the Chumash area when one of his students who had taken datura talked about seeing his regular vision was filled with white dots. I don't spend much time talking about that because datura is not something you really want to encourage someone to experiment with, since it is, in fact, the difference between being a medicine, having a vision, and dying is very small. and
Right.
and without that knowledge, it's an extremely risky activity to engage in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a comment from Lee Marimore. He says the red painted lines in the BRM at Site E was noticed by Jim Blakely and credited to him.
Oh, okay. That's I learned it from Amy.
Okay, so somebody asked, and you kind of went into this a bit, but why does the presence of cupules necessarily associate them with females?
What I'm looking at, particularly here in Hurricane Deck and in the Chumash interior, where you see these large masses of cupules, is they are almost always associated with bedrock mortars and female processing areas. And because it was a matrilineal society, those areas were owned by females, not by males. And so if you find lone cupule boulders in a village or someplace like that outside of a gathering area, they may have an entirely different meaning or purpose. But I'm looking at them in this area is that the heavy association with cupules are in direct association with bedrock mortars and female processing sites. The Milky Way at Pool Rock in a Condor Cave, those cupules may have been made by men as being the astronomers, if you want, in Chumash society. So I'm not saying that men would not have made cupules, that cupules couldn't have been made as men. I'm looking at the predominant appearance of cupules as being intimately associated with bedrock mortars and female processing sites.
Okay, a couple more comments or questions on the quids. So one of them is, do you think that they chewed them more than once and then stored them for reuse?
I don't know. It's possible, but there's a lot of them that are stored, and when they were first discovered, they noticed teeth marks in them and so forth. I don't know if you would use up all of the active ingredients in a set of leaves after you've chewed on them, or whether there would be stuff left. And that I can't say one way or the other.
Yeah, maybe they gave them to their patients and they chewed off the most active parts, and then you could have a
Well, if
smaller
you think
amount.
of what you have to go through to take datura, you need a knowledgeable person. In chewing the leaves, you're getting a much smaller dose. And so that's something an individual could do on their own without having to have a guide there to protect them and make sure that they did what they needed to do. The other thing is that if a woman took datura, she was protected from bears. And this area is, there's a lot of bears in Chumash territory, and there would have been a lot of bears out in there. The Chumash and bears were interacted all the time. In the ethnography, there's lessons that if you encounter a bear, you stand absolutely still, you don't make any noise, and you don't look it in the eyes, and it will walk away. And if you do anything else, you're in deep trouble. But the women would have been in most frequent contact with bears because the same plant stuffs that women are gathering to process for food are the same plants that bears are gathering to eat. So they would come into contact with one another. And it may be that the datura leaves were chewed by women to just protect themselves from bears. But I'm not. I think viewing it as a medicine is a more generic view as opposed to a very specific purpose that I'd have no way of proving. And there's no ethnography other than that women can take datura to protect themselves from bears when they are out in the countryside.
Yeah, I mean, a similar comment came in, wondering if the quids were placed into the cracks to block evil from reemerging to further harm a sick person, followed by the comment that cupules in the Great Basin are regarded as very old rock art created by women to memorialize live births, further supporting the women-centric art hypothesis here.
I don't have an argument with that, and I know some cupule rocks are medicine rocks in the Nevada area, and there's still rocks, if you know where they are, in Nevada that are still being visited by Native Americans, and offerings are being left. Whether or not they are related to births in the Chumash area, I don't have any information on that, but there's lots of different functions that cupules played in different cultures. So I can't agree with that or disagree with that. That's it's another explanation or story that should be on the table in considering interpretations of rock art.
Yeah, so speaking of interpretations, did you have any thoughts about the concentric circles in that last photo?
That particular set of concentric circles was included in Hudson and Lee and Hedges' listing of winter solstice sites, because Ed Edwards, who hiked a lot of this area, photographed that set of concentric circles divided in half on the winter solstice, which makes a good story. Except I photographed that image in February, and when I first got there, it was divided in half, and I had to wait for the sun to rise a little higher for it to be in full sunlight. And what happens when you're there and look at it, the surface of the sandstone happens to have a dip in it, and the circle is painted across that dip. So when the sun's in the sky, unless it's fully illuminating that circle, it's always divided in half because of how the rock is formed. So that was doesn't have anything to do with the winter solstice, because it happens all year long at different times of the day. depending on how the sun hits it.
Yeah, so it's important to visit these sites on non important times of year, I guess, to verify that. Um, there was a comment here on the talking about the Milky Way, so I'm just going to read this to you, and then you could comment on that. With the summer and winter Milky Way branches wheeling all around the sky, the Milky Way can be claimed at many times to have any and all orientations.
Correct.
Further, the projection onto the sky of a line on a rock panel in a cave can be done in many ways. So, by your stated logic, an enthusiastic worker can always connect any and all linear features with the Milky Way. Further, the Milky Way does not visibly bifurcate, as you have implied, and one of your rock art depictions is splaying out in all directions, completely different from the visible Milky Way. So your stated connection from the rock art to the Milky Way may not be that reliable. Can you offer any ethnographic connection to the Milky Way?
First off, the physical, the orientation of Hurricane Deck and its steep side creates a very distinctive view of the heavens when you're at the base of Hurricane Deck. Given its height and the fact that it's flat on top, there's no trees, etc. And I have seen that being there at night. You can observe the Milky Way turning in the sky. The bifurcation comes from Chumash ethnography. In the winter, when it becomes the pathway of the dead, it's because it bifurcates at the end, and that's how the Chumash viewed it. And the one path took you to the land of the dead, and the other path took you to the underworld to become I'm not a good Chumash speaker, to become a Nunesis, which is an evil spirit that lives in the lower world. And you could not pass into the land of the dead, which is where you wanted to go, unless you had taken Datura and gone through a Datura ceremony at some point in your life. So I included that speculation of the Milky Way because I believe we get locked into one interpretation. So when Condor Cave was described as being a winter solstice site, that became then the explanation for a lot of Chumash rock art. And I just wanted to suggest that it's good to take a step back and look at alternative interpretations. I would be the first to say that that is the most tenuous part of my three different looks at Chumash rock art. But it's meant to sort of free the mind from these things being winter solstice sites and say there's alternative explanations that might be more reasonable. And if Hurricane Deck did not form this dramatic horizon at night, I probably would not have talked about that possible interpretation. It's distinctive to that particular environmental feature.
Yeah, sometimes being there gives you ideas you wouldn't get just looking at photos and such.
Right.
Another interpretation you had that was pretty interesting was the relationship between the bedrock mortars and the bear paws, and talking about the bear claws as a clan symbol. To sort of back that up, you would expect that in some other region you'd find bedrock mortars associated with a different clan symbol. Have such things been found?
Nobody's done that kind of study. And I myself have not had I've not had the opportunity to go back and look at sites in quite the way that I have at Hurricane Deck. The idea of looking at them in close association, David Robinson, in the work that he's doing in another Chumash area, the San Miguel area, and they've been doing a lot of XRF studies with painting sites, and the woman doing the XRF study, by virtue of being female, noted in one panel with a lot of complex paintings is that the paintings were painted and retouched at multiple times with different pigment compositions. And this painted panel where she did this study is in direct association with bedrock mortars. And her analysis was, why would it be the men coming in and painting and coming in and retouching, as opposed to the women that are here processing their plant materials, doing the touch, they can reach out and touch the paintings. Why is it unreasonable that they weren't the ones doing the retouching and adding to the painted panels? And so that idea I was building off of her observations, which again are tenuous, but we don't talk about women and rock art in the Chumash area. All of the descriptions of rock art attribute it to shamans, and shamans are male, and so male did the paintings. And Travis Hudson went so far as to say, once the site was painted, then it was off limits altogether. So if there's bedrock mortars there, the females were there processing plant foods, somebody came along and did paintings, and now the site is off limits to other people. That I think is just wrong-headed thinking, and I'm trying to open new questions for people to ask, and instead of accepting that men made rock art and women didn't, take a look at it in a different way.
Yeah. Was the painting done with some kind of brush, or was it done by fingers?
Some of it was done with fingers. Most of it was done with brushes. What's important in looking at the painting process, in the San Miguel area, there is blue pigment. And that blue pigment is not actually blue. It's a blend of white and black. It's a gray, and visually, when that gray is in association with red or yellow, it looks blue. And that can only happen if the pigment is ground to the right fine consistency. And what I started to look at in this, what I believe is the hematite roasting pit, is that in fact, we're starting to see evidence that the Chumash were very sophisticated in making their pigments. We know, and there are archaeological examples of pigment cakes that we know were traded and had value, and they had value because they had Atashwan. They had the power that an individual gets from taking datura. And so what I'm starting to describe is individuals with specialties in a population that had skills and an understanding of working with materials that have been lost from us. And David Scott, who I did some pigment studies with from the Getty, he noted the grain size of pigments is within about 20% of what commercial pigment makers get to today. So these were very sophisticated craftsmen who were doing this work and making the pigments, and understood how they interacted to create colors that they wanted to create. And I'm just suggesting that, once again, we think of all of this being done as by men. And in Site E, it may, in fact, we see evidence that it was being done by women as opposed to men. It may have been men. I'm not saying they couldn't make bedrock mortars and grind pigments and make cupules and all of that, but let's throw away that old thinking and ask a different kind of question. And there's evidence to support a different point of view.
Yeah, well, that's great. So one final comment says Rick would be very pleased. And so I think that would be a nice note to end on. You definitely have us thinking about a lot of possible interpretations. So thanks again to Bill Hyder for his presentation, and thanks to all the attendees for your interest. If you would like to learn more about what ARARA does, please check out our website and Facebook pages. Our next speaker on October 10th will be Ann Stoll on the rock art of Zimbabwe. And in November, we'll head to the Canadian Shield with Dagmara Zawadzka. Until then, good evening and stay safe.
Thank you, everyone.